My dad said I'm not a nurse and walked out the door while Mom was still sitting in the doctor's office parking lot processing her diagnosis. My name is Rachel Owens, 29 years old, home healthcare coordinator in Memphis, Tennessee, a woman who spends every working day arranging care for people whose families actually show up. My mother, Diane Owens, 54 years old, was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis 10 years ago, a condition affecting the nervous system that makes ordinary tasks progressively harder. My father, Frank Owens, 57 years old, heard the diagnosis, drove home, packed 2 bags, and said he hadn't signed up for this. I was 17. I stood in the doorway and watched him load his car. What he didn't know was the 17-year-old girl he left standing in that doorway was already deciding who she would become without him. Mom didn't cry in front of me that night. She made dinner, set 2 plates instead of 3, and never once said his name with anything other than quiet neutrality for the next 10 years. I was the one who cried in the bathroom, door locked, water running so she wouldn't hear. I called my closest friend Troy Simmons, 32 years old, a financial records analyst at a Memphis firm, the kind of person who stays on the line without saying anything unnecessary. He just listened. The last thing Dad said before he drove away was said directly to me, not Mom, me, standing in the hallway with my arms crossed. He said, "I married your mother, Rachel. I didn't sign up to be her nurse." One sentence, flat. Like a door closing. I stayed quiet for a reason. Because the moment he said those words I realized arguing with him would only give him an exit he didn't deserve to take gracefully. The years after Dad left had a rhythm to them: medical appointments, medication schedules, insurance paperwork, meal planning, and me learning everything I could about MS so Mom never had to face a doctor's question alone. I built my career around it, became a healthcare coordinator, learned the system from the inside so I could work it for her. What I didn't know, what none of us talked about openly, was that Mom's older sister, my Aunt Carol, 61 years old, had been watching everything from 3 streets over. Quietly, carefully, every time a support payment didn't arrive, which became every time after the first 8 months, Aunt Carol wrote it down. Date, amount owed, running total. Filed it in a kitchen drawer that was starting to get very full. But that wasn't the worst part. Aunt Carol hadn't just been watching. She had been writing down every single month he didn't pay, date, amount, running total, for 10 years straight. I found out about the support agreement properly when I was 22. Mom mentioned it once, quietly, almost apologetically, when I asked why certain months felt tighter than others. Dad had signed a financial support agreement as part of the separation, a legal commitment, his signature, witnessed and filed, to contribute a set monthly amount toward Mom's medical costs. He paid for 8 months, then stopped. No explanation, no call, just nothing. I went to Mom's medicine cabinet that same evening and counted what was left, 3 days of her primary medication. The refill cost was exactly the amount one missed monthly payment would have covered. I stood there with the bottles in my hand for a long time. What he didn't know was, the night I counted Mom's last 3 days of medication was the night I stopped waiting for him to do the right thing on his own. 4 years of silence. No birthday calls, no holidays, no check-ins. Then one Thursday morning my phone rang and it was Dad, voice warm, casual, like we spoke every week. He had a cardiac condition, required consistent monitoring. Lifestyle adjustments. He used words like support system and family with the ease of someone who had never once questioned his right to either. He talked for 11 minutes without asking about Mom, without asking about me. When he finally paused, I understood exactly what this call was. He needed the thing he had refused to provide. He needed someone to coordinate his care. He called the daughter he walked out on to become the nurse he never was. I let the silence sit for a moment, then I said the only words that mattered, "I know, Dad, I know more than you think." The line went very quiet after that. I stayed quiet for a reason. Because some conversations don't need more words, they need the other person to finally understand the weight of theirs. If this story is hitting somewhere real for you, subscribe and stay close. Because what happens next, he never saw coming. I called Troy that same evening, told him everything. He was already pulling up financial record frameworks before I finished the second sentence. Troy located the original separation agreement through the county family records filing system, a public document, properly accessible, still active. Dad's signature on page 3, the monthly commitment amount on page 1. And a clause on page 4 that Dad had clearly never read carefully or chosen to forget. Missed payments under this agreement didn't simply disappear. They accumulated as a documented financial obligation, with interest. Compounding for 10 years, Troy ran the calculation quietly and turned his laptop toward me without saying a word. The number on that screen was significant, but that wasn't the worst part. The separation agreement had a clause about accumulated missed payments, and Troy had already calculated exactly what 10 years of skipped months added up to. I photographed every page, called Aunt Carol. She already had her folder ready. Aunt Carol's folder and Troy's calculation together formed one complete picture. 10 years, every month documented, every amount recorded. The total owed was not a small number. It was a decade of obligation Dad had simply decided to ignore because no one had come after him for it. Yet, I spent one evening organizing everything into a single submission package. Aunt Carol's handwritten records, Troy's financial calculation, the original signed agreement, and a formal discrepancy notification addressed to the Community Financial Mediation Office in Atlanta, the city where Dad now lived with his carefully constructed version of events. I almost didn't send it. I sat there staring at that folder for a long time, thinking about Mom's face, about the medication cabinet, about 17-year-old me in that doorway. Then I sealed the envelope. What he didn't know was the folder wasn't going to his front door. It was going to the Financial Mediation Office, where Sandra would also be notified as a co-filing household member. The mediation office acknowledged receipt within 48 hours. Standard procedure, all parties named in the original agreement were formally notified of the discrepancy filing. Dad called me 4 days later. I knew from the first syllable that the folder had arrived. Gone was the warm, casual voice from the Thursday call. This was a different man, tighter, careful, choosing words the way someone does when they realize the conversation might matter later. He asked me why I did it. I told him I did what the agreement required. He said he thought we had moved past all of that. I asked him, which day was she supposed to just ignore her medication running out? He had no answer for that. The line went quiet for a long time. I stayed quiet for a reason. When he called back, his voice had lost that easy confidence he always carried, and that told me the folder had arrived exactly where it needed to go. The Community Financial Mediation meeting was scheduled 3 weeks later in Atlanta. I drove down, sat across a table from Dad for the first time in 4 years. He looked older, careful, like a man who had spent several weeks rehearsing. Sandra Owens, 53 years old, Dad's wife, a former accounting manager with 20 years of financial oversight experience who had clearly been told a particular version of events, sat beside him with the submission folder open in front of her. The mediator read the documented payment history aloud, month by month, year by year. Sandra followed along with the focused attention of someone who has spent decades reading financial records and knowing immediately when something doesn't add up. When she reached the 10-year total, she set the folder down, folded her hands, and looked directly at the mediator, not Dad, and asked in a completely level voice, "Were these payments ever disclosed on our joint financial filings?" Dad said nothing. The mediator made a note, but that wasn't the worst part. That note was now part of the official permanent record, and Sandra's expression told me she already understood exactly what that meant. Dad signed the structured repayment plan before the meeting ended, not out of guilt, but because the alternative was a public courtroom and Sandra sitting across from him, having lost every last piece of respect she had held onto during that meeting. The payments were redirected directly to Mom's medical account. Monthly, automatic, starting within 3 weeks. Mom never knew the full story. She just noticed one Tuesday that the financial pressure she had quietly carried for 10 years felt lighter. She didn't ask why. I used to think people who walk away from hard things eventually outrun the consequences. Now I know paper doesn't forget, even when people do. And the truth has a way of arriving exactly when it's most needed, quietly, completely, without a single raised voice. If this story sat with you, subscribe and drop your city below. I read every single one. What he didn't know was, Mom never asked me what I did. She just squeezed my hand one evening and said, "I don't know what you did, baby, but something feels different. Thank you." He said he wasn't a nurse. I became one anyway for both of us. The difference is I actually showed up.